Chase the Wind by Devi, read by Devi. It was a breezy day, the wind gusts approximately 35 miles an hour, according to the weather report. As he listened to the weather on the Channel 5 news, he put pen to paper and painstakingly wrote 3 short lines, a few numbers, and several letters. His handwriting had never been the best, and the gloves he was wearing made it even harder to write. Then he folded the white piece of paper in half. He threw on a light windbreaker and headed out to an old beat-up Schwinn bicycle. The elementary school was less than a mile from where he lived. It didn't take long to get there. He still had a little time before the kids would get out, and he was the only one in the large parking lot. The sky above was a moody gray, dark clouds threatening to spill rain at any given moment. The breeze and occasional aforementioned wind gusts were cold enough to get into his jacket and chill him. He wasn't at all certain what the outcome of this would be. It didn't really matter to him, actually. He had done his part. His part was over as soon as he threw the paper into the wind, which he did then. A particularly strong gust of wind had just come up, and it grabbed the paper from his fingers, taking it the way a greedy dog will nip at your fingers for its treat. For a split second, the man considered keeping the paper, even of going after it as the wind rushed it off and away from him. Then the feeling was gone. He turned his bicycle back the direction he had come and pedaled off for home. Meanwhile, the piece of paper with the 3 lines of writing on it was busy being tossed around by the wind. It would rise up only to plummet, only to rise again higher this time, twirling, going end over end, even opening slightly at the fold and shutting again. It made its way to directly in front of the school doors. There it dropped to the ground as if it had always lain there. Just a white piece of paper, any piece of paper, really. Cars began to show up, pulling into 2 parallel lanes in front of the school. The disturbance in the air caused the paper to move a bit to the left. Then the wind gusted again, and the paper danced on air once more. One end down, it spun around as it lifted slightly up off the ground. Then it was on an invisible hamster wheel, turning in the air and making 2 revolutions before it again lay dormant on the ground. By now, a few parents had shown up on foot. They walked by the paper without seeing it. One person kicked it without noticing, pushing it further in towards the school doors and out of the reach of the wind. The school doors finally opened, and the kids began to come out in what seemed in a somewhat orderly fashion. There was much commotion, and the general volume rose up, as it does when many children are around. A few kids paused and even looked down at the paper, but kept on their way to meet their parents. One child stepped on the paper, ripping it a bit, as he started running for the car his father was waiting in. At long last, a little girl and her teacher stepped in front of the white piece of paper. They had stopped to talk, and while the teacher did, the little girl looked down. She saw the paper. Pointing at it, she said something to her teacher. "Did you drop that, Samantha?" Ms. DeVore asked. Samantha thought for a moment. She hadn't. She hated to lie, but she could see by the way the paper was laying that there was something written on it, and Samantha was nothing if not a curious child. Finally, she decided to just be honest. "I didn't, but I really would like to look at it." Ms. DeVore smiled kindly. "Well, let's have a look at it then." Samantha bent down quickly and picked the paper up. Her imagination was already working overtime. The paper could quite literally be anything while it remained folded in half. A treasure map, a pretty picture, a beautifully crafted poem, a note to her from a mysterious stranger. "Well, are you going to open it?" Miss DeVore asked, laughing. Samantha realized she had merely been staring at the folded paper. Oh, duh. She opened it, stared at what was written there, and frowned. "Don't keep me in suspense. What is it, a hidden treasure map?" "Nah, just some numbers and words," Samantha said, and handed the paper to her teacher. She thought it was funny that Miss DeVore had hoped it was a map, too. Miss DeVore took it and looked at what was written there in blue ink. There were 4 lines. The first, 4545. The second, Woodlake. The third, Forestvale. And the fourth, simply 02. Well, you better get going. I see your mom is over there waiting." "Yes, ma'am." Samantha hugged Miss DeVore and then ran to her mother's car, the paper already forgotten. Miss DeVore folded the paper back in half, then in half again. She had considered throwing it in the trash. Of course she had. It was just trash, after all. However, there was something that made her fold it up instead and put it in her back pocket. Later, when she had time, she told herself, she would look more closely and perhaps know what it was all about. As it was, the paper would have gone, forgotten, through the clothes washer had it not been for her bad memory, which ironically was also why it would have ended up there. Miss DeVore had forgotten her grocery list at home, even though she planned to stop on her way home from school to do her shopping. As she was checking her pockets for the list, she encountered the paper from the school. Lots of good this is going to do me there, she muttered and then laughed at herself. She was always forgetting something, and at 62 years old was quite used to it. What could this mean? She frowned at the paper, concentrating. Suddenly she smiled. Why, of course, Woodlake was a street in Forestvale, her town. It was an address. 4545 Woodlake, Forestvale. She guessed that the '02 was for 59602, one of the 3 zip codes in the area. That was all well and good, but what would someone write an address like that, and who had this paper been for? Who, for that matter, had written it? Ms. DeVore pondered this as she walked around the market, picking up this and that mainly on autopilot. She was lost in thought. Woodlake was one of the older streets in town. Ms. DeVore pictured the old, somewhat run-down houses there. Many of them were neglected, some outright abandoned. She was sure a few had been condemned. Again, why would someone write this address to one on a piece of paper, and how did it end up at the elementary school all the way across town? Ms. DeVore made up her mind. She was going to go there and see 4545 Woodlake herself. The drive to Woodlake took approximately 15 minutes. During that time, Ms. DeVore told herself flat out that she was crazy. She should have just thrown the paper in the garbage at the school. The trash can had been less than 4 feet from her at the time, and it would have been much easier and smarter, she told herself, to have thrown it away without a second thought. Instead, here she was, gallivanting around town and hunting down an address that would most likely prove to just be someone's house. However, Mrs. DeVore loved a good mystery. As she turned left onto Woodlake, she steeled herself for disappointment. She also promised herself that if the house was lived in, she would most certainly not go knock on the door. She laughed, picturing herself trying to explain why she was there. Sorry to bother you, but I found a piece of trash with your address on it, and I just had to come. She laughed harder at the thought of saying this to the owner of the house at 4545 Woodlake. When she pulled up to the house, which was on the right side of the street, these thoughts and all laughter ceased immediately. There was no mailbox. Miss DeVore knew it was the right house because above the garage door, the numbers 4545 could still be seen. The years had taken their toll on it, but that could be said for the entire house. This was one of the condemned houses. In Mrs. DeVore's opinion, it should have been bulldozed a long time ago. Graffiti covered the front of the once white house. It was a one-story, probably with a basement. All the windows had been broken out, and the glass littered the dirt outside each one. There was no lawn, though at one time there might have been. It occurred for a moment to Miss DeVore that for that much glass to be outside the house, the windows must have broken out from the inside. This thought nagged her for a moment, but she let it go. She was too busy fighting with herself about what was coming next. I will not get out of the car, she said aloud. She had meant it to sound authoritative, but it came out in an unconvincing whisper. After grabbing a flashlight out of the glove box, Miss DeVore opened her car door and got out. Even the walkway up to the house was awful. It was made up of broken stones with weeds poking up through every open spot possible. She stepped on them as she went up the walk, heading towards a door she had no intention of opening. Who had written this address down and left it for her to find? Were they hoping she would come here? A shiver ran up Miss DeVore's spine. It would be best to turn around right now and get back in the car. It would be best to drive away and never think on this again. She tried the doorknob. Much to her surprise, it turned and the door opened. Miss DeVore stepped inside. At first, she couldn't see a thing. After the light of the day, even overcast, her eyes had to adjust to the dusty darkness of the entryway of a house that had probably been abandoned for months or even years. Who really knew the last time someone had stepped foot inside? Miss DeVore felt the coldness of the house acutely. It had no warmth from human touch, no echoes of cheerful human voices, or laughter of children. It was a prison of sadness and despair to Miss DeVore, a place where happiness came to die. She didn't like it at all and had just decided to turn and leave once and for all, to put this craziness behind her, when she heard something that stopped her dead in her tracks. A cry of despair, clear as day. Miss DeVore's breath caught in her throat and she froze, listening intently. Had she really heard someone crying out? Softly, yes, and quietly, but still a human being, here in this condemned house. Hello, Miss DeVore said aloud and instantly regretted it. Her voice sounded overly loud and intrusive in the dark silence of the house. Out of place completely. Yet there it was again, the sound of someone crying. Well, this is just ridiculous. I'm a grown woman, Miss DeVore said and turned her flashlight on. She headed deeper into the house, following where she thought the crying had come from. The house wasn't overly large. It did, however, have outside rooms and then inside rooms. That was, rooms that bordered on the outside of the house and had windows, most of which were broken out, and then what appeared to be at least two rooms that were interior only and had no windows. Ms. DeVore saved these for last, not really wanting to go into them as there was no light except for her flashlight. It was the last room, but then wasn't it always? Ms. DeVore was just beginning to feel foolish as she came into the last interior room, but it was short-lived feeling. Her flashlight played across the walls, which were covered with empty bookshelves. As she went to pan across the room, the light hit something slumped in the corner of the room, something that had the vague shape and size of a human being. Miss DeVore screamed. She backed up, running into the wall, though it let out another small scream. She wanted to run, to bolt out of this house in this situation, to run to her car and drive away, and instead she aimed her flashlight back on the shape and made herself see what it actually was. A person, but not someone to be feared. In fact, she realized this person was hurt, badly. Miss DeVore could now see that the person was tied up and had a gag in their mouth. There was blood, too much blood, around them, and their face was covered with both the blood and bruises. She couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl or the person's age. When the light hit them, the tied person quickly shut their eyes but cried out, making the sound Miss DeVore had heard earlier when she had entered the house. The gag was not entirely effective at keeping them quiet. Miss DeVore rushed over to the person. Oh my God, I'm here now. You're going to be okay. Oh, who did this to you? We have to get you out of here and get you some help. Forestvale news. Breaking news. Local teacher saves kidnapping victim. Gets tip from litter. A piece of trash and a curious teacher have saved a life today in Forestvale, Montana. He took out a piece of white paper and began to write on it, making sure his handwriting was neat and readable. It was a nice windy day, and he wasn't that far away from the strip mall. He could be there on his bicycle in less than an hour.